He will not force
Well, thank you very much for keeping the time during the break. We are now moving on to another format, which is Conversations with Artists. And I have the great privilege to open this portion of today's event with a conversation with Shahja Sikandar. And it's always a slightly difficult thing to introduce someone who genuinely needs no introduction. But just to rehearse a bit of what you already know, Shahja, Pakistan's foremost artist, trained at the National College of Arts in Lahore and at RISD at the Rhode Island School of Design in Rhode Island in the United States. Worked with Bashir Ahmed on the miniature, reinvented the miniature, which had been a dead tradition, and was the first woman to teach miniature painting in NCA in Lahore and in Pakistan. She moved to the US as a student, where she won the highly prestigious and so-called Genius Award, the MacArthur Foundation Award. Her work has won many prizes. She's showed in many places, the Hirshhorn Gallery, for instance. Her work spans a whole array of genres, starting with painting, of course, but also animation very recently, murals, and video. And we hope to see some specimens of each of these genres. So what I want to do is, I'll begin with one comment, and then Shahja will respond while also showing us some of her work, and then I'll have a couple of more, and we'll modulate in this way. So, when I first saw Shahja's work, what struck me was that it immediately made me think how interesting it was that colonial rule seems to have utterly destroyed pre-colonial visual regimes, which is to say there is no unbroken school of sculpture or painting that has survived as a continuous tradition. On the other hand, the oral forms of artistry seem to have survived quite well, whether it's poetry or song, music. And that struck me, if I'm correct, it's an intriguing phenomenon. And it says something about the strongly visual character of colonial rule, that breaks. And so it's only in the visual arts that the problem of recovery becomes thought as such. And that doesn't really seem to be the case in poetry, song, and music, which, however, continue to have a kind of dynamic development. It's not like they are static in any way. So when Shahja began her work, in a way what I see her as doing is precisely not continuing a tradition. The tradition had been broken. It didn't exist any longer. And she seems to be fully conscious of this. And if you think about some of her early work, which is in the form of palimpsest, where she's taking tourist miniatures that are produced fakes, as it were, for tourists, and painting over them, as if to show there is no original. It's just layers and layers, turtles, as we say, all the way down. So there's self-consciousness about that, which I find very interesting, because it moves away from the quite tired narrative of originality and derivation, the search for origins or the rejection of origins. Something else seems to be going on here. At the same time, in Pakistan, abstraction, which we take to be a rupture with the past, was being quickly assimilated to state-centered and indeed Islamist projects. Islamists love nothing more than abstraction. It's an extraordinary thing. So the very thing which otherwise symbolizes rupture and newness and difference actually ends up being, in a place like Pakistan, the mainstay of conservatism, the establishment, continuity, and Islamism. And so it's something that one doesn't normally consider. But in that sense, Shazia's work, precisely because it focused on images in a very hybrid way, actually was the more dangerous work, in my view. The image is always more dangerous in those societies. Abstraction is not dangerous. Either intellectually, perhaps, and certainly not politically. So there seems to be a kind of setting things on their heads that's going on there that I found very interesting. And of course, this is something highly ironic as well. So I wonder if Shazia, you can take us through some of your early work, the scroll, for instance, to show us how you play with the visual dimension of the miniature, the new miniature.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Faisal. So before I share my work in more detail, I want to give you a sense of what drives me to create. And, because this conference is so much about us all questioning how to move forward on ideas of freedom. So, flux, dislocation of objects, ideas, concepts, forms, how meaning is constantly in movement, that's always captured my imagination. Historically, the movement of bodies, objects, such as in trade, slavery, migration, colonial occupation, has forced meaning to shift and oscillate with every generation. When one thinks in terms of narratives and how history is determined, how real is that account? Our histories are about redactions. Imagination, thus, for me, as an artist, is a privilege, taking ownership of the narrative. And thus, for me, art remains a fundamentally political stance. So drawing is a thinking tool, a notational tool, a fundamental language through which I construct a range of works and formats to engage with the world. So when I joined NCA, the National College of Arts in Lahore, it was the 1986 to 1987 session, just for dates. I was in an intuitive mode, seeking what would speak to me. I gravitated towards miniature painting, an anomaly amid the highly westernized teaching methods, a traditional art form seen then as derivative and cliched, incapable of intellectual rigor. Coming to art from a background of math, I was interested in language and application, not hierarchies. So the scroll was much celebrated thesis. It won every possible award. I was on the cover of every newspaper with then again the same prime minister, but it was an interesting moment in terms of that turning point. So it's 1989 to 90 when I made the scroll. It was a product of an investigative approach to then so-called assumption or understanding of tradition during the 4.5 years at NCA as a student. It was a game changer in many ways. It's more than 5 feet, took me a year plus to make, 18 hours a day, abandoning the expected notebook scale and illustrations of traditional rituals like basant, weddings or kite flying. The scroll explored the impact of youth, the flux of identity, narrative as a moving image, picture plane as an infinite space. I was looking at narrative structures in film, cinema, as well as the use of light in Safavid painting. So early on, I started playing with ideas of center and margin for obvious reasons. The miniatures have these borders. So I was dislocating framing devices to open up narratives of gender, sexuality, and race. Humor, irony, wit, self-critique were incredibly instrumental in creating a dialogue with something that resists translation. So, of course, then I can't talk about all the work, but I will focus on certain works. So homosexuality, for example, and its very precarious existence within the Punjabi culture of Lahore became a topic, layered further by stylizing my gay protagonist into a Mughal portrait. Then layering further with iconographies of gender to punctuate the androgynous within the eroticized space of the miniature. Ismat Chuktai, Kishwar Nahid, they started to converse with my readings of Fatima Marnisi, Helen Susu, as I started to manipulate the established forms and pictorial conventions. Sissu's idea of female writing or white ink, as in The Newly Born Woman, alongside Pupen Kakkar, then Eva Hesse's, in my interest in Eva Hesse's post-minimalist, soul-injecting female forms, I could trace my own relationship with the very male-dominated miniature painting field. My work started reflecting an evocative engagement with feminism and sexuality. In some of the works, the white ink as a visual metaphor was also a play on the use of white gouache, the opaque or gadrang of miniature. So here in this particular work, which is interesting since we were talking about the symbolic idea of the horse, right? So I'm inserting a white line atop a male figure. I was also proposing the androgynous as the self. And so it's interesting how this, if you took a magnifying glass and you saw it, the figure of the male is still there. So desexualized figures, androgyny, these were like digging into the idea of beauty as monstrous. So this whole series that I did, Monsters to Midgets, was an indirect arrival to the human form by subverting the dead decorative arts in books on Islamic art, by infusing their form and physicality with the perceived lurking, menacing vitality. My visual lexicon that sort of to emerge was a sort of a parallel to the use of text in the work also, which of course captures my imagination because writing is, its inherent ability to redact is very important to me, especially in terms of how cultural and political spheres function, but also how the importance of writing in Islam. And visual inspiration, the geometric underpinnings of Arabic script. But not just that, it was also playing with gestures of independence, like the US Constitution as an authoritative gesture. So I was questioning what happens to authority over time. And time becomes sort of a nemesis. So I think my work is so much about time as it sort of like functions through all these different spheres. And so it's interesting that you're asking me to also look backward and look at sort of this production. So first things that start to happen is like I'm painting these drawings and they're small, but for me, these are heroic works. But I'm also kind of like, I want to look at this history and it's so truncated. So then, of course, a lot of it exists in institutions that are in the West or in India. And as a Pakistani, it was very hard to, even when I reached out to Nilman Ghulam Sheikh early on to go do an internship, I couldn't get the visa. So that's an interesting idea that we're talking about this intimacy and proximity between India and Pakistan, but there is a very separateness. We take for granted mobility that many of us have because a lot of us have citizenships of other countries. So even then, so I had to just slowly sort of give away this desire to go and take ownership of some of that shared history. Because there is no proximity, there is no free, unless you're very much part of the very upper middle class with connections that you can get visas. So that's also a really complex idea of time, because time goes so fast. And then, so what are these narratives that we are creating where India-Pakistan artistic situations are like talking about this intimacy? I find it very theatrical. So here, sort of that's what I try to do, is like take that preciousness and break out of the preciousness and in the process also think of inventing forms and materiality of paper. It's subjected to take it out of the wasli, like not obsess and fetishize over that, but and then at the same time, understand how do you own tradition? How do you create language? Language doesn't just happen by appropriating certain things and then hiding, calling that your own. That type of ownership didn't happen because I was already looking at miniature through what Bashir shared, and through his language, but also through catalogs printed by the West. So there is this indirectness also as one of the many layers. So sort of this starts to happen, though large-scale works that I started to do where I am playing with space and disruptions of scale, they become essential in the 1990s in addition to sort of unsettling compositional and iconographical content. The work sort of engages in destabilizing the actual medium itself of drawing.
Could I just interrupt and say that what strikes me at this phase of your work is, what I see Shaja is doing here is literally blowing up the miniature. So you already, sorry to speak about you in the third person, you already broke the frames as you showed us earlier. But now, in a way, you're literally blowing up the form in this extraordinary way, because the more monumental they become, look at this, the more monumental, the more translucent, the more evanescent. This is a play of light. Yeah. It's massive. And you can actually literally sneak into it, as I think you do.
But then when you see, when you look at Islamic, this idea of the manuscript, the Islamic art, some of the very beautiful abstract ideas in there, there's a lot, language is about light too. A lot of it is about abstraction, it's about dream, it's about having dreamt of the Prophet too, as like this idea of sacredness, of purity. So it's all very...
But why, I'm sorry, this is a discomforting comment for me to make, but you've taken the miniature, you've specialized in it, you know all the as if traditional ways of doing it, how to make the thing, how to make the brush out of squirrel's tails, how to actually paint it, unlike many of your others who have come after you, print out their miniatures and stick them onto the Vasli. So you have taken the miniature in this other direction. And yet, in your country of birth, where the neo-miniature has become a flourishing form, I don't really see that happening. I'm not, this might go back to what you were saying about proximity and intimacy and the lack of it. You were talking about India, Pakistan. I entirely agree. But within Pakistan itself, in a way, if I might say so, you're not intimate with the artwork happening in Pakistan at the moment. So their way of, the new miniature in Pakistan owes its existence to you because you are the founding figure of it. But you're doing this to it, it's proceeding along other kinds of lines in which certain things are made important and not others. So if you take someone like Rashid Rana, there's a kind of laboriousness. He takes the labor-intensive character of the miniature, of the old miniature, and it comes out in these, obsessive photographs, miniatures. But of course, it depends upon a sweatshop, I imagine. An Asian sweatshop of workers, like Indian and Pakistani couturiers who put embroidery on everything because they have the workers who are there to do it. So there's a laboriousness, but no interruption of the form. Or you have Saira Wasim, who has this kind of quite flat and, in my view, insipid ways of thinking about the miniature. You need not comment. These are my comments. I will take responsibility.
You created a rupture here. I'm going to talk about my work.
I just wanted to, as you're going through your work, to say something about the loss of intimacy with Pakistan.
I'll talk about the loss of intimacy with the art world. It's interesting because I think when I first come on the scene, there's a whole list of people wanting to buy those miniatures. So I get punished because that's not what I want to do. I don't want to sit there and make the miniatures. Plus, I make them myself, except for one group of works that I did called The Extraordinary Realities, where I did add collage on 6 drawings, which were found in Houston. So I was playing on other issues of those Indian sort of markets within the U.S. So that's what happened. I don't want to be. I don't want labor as value for what I was doing. That's what was being seen. This is early 90s. So there's a whole kind of essentialization that's also bound to happen because the larger, broader topics are on identity. So no matter what you did, you were straitjacketed. But it was not that, oh, you were catering to the West by doing miniature. That narrative is incorrect, which has often come out of Pakistan. That narrative is untrue because I was already celebrated. I brought so much attention to miniature painting in Pakistan, which is why I was invited to teach right away with Bashir. But Bashir was also instrumental in creating sort of that rupture because when I first gravitate to him, I'm interested in him as a personality, as somebody from a lower middle class, income class from Pakistan who's kind of juggling all these gatekeeping that happens, as we all know. So it's not something I'm talking that is difficult to absorb, but like gatekeeping happens in South Asia by a certain elite. We still have a feudal culture. So then you see that dynamic, and I'm like, oh, this is so interesting because Bashir, whenever there's a foreign entity, you take them and say, oh, this is our culture. But then whenever that entity disappeared, you could just be dismissive of it. So I was kind of curious and questioning that, but I was also very young. So I am already I'm 18 or less. So it's not like, so it's intuitive digging too. And I think that then the 6 years in Pakistan making and putting a thesis out and then teaching there and signaling to other students that they could also see the viability in it and then taking it at an international stage and then creating a lot more ruptures where you start to bring the language to a global, not global, like a more international space. So to how to create relevance to the idiom. A lot of it is happening because of the interface of artistic desire, intuition, creativity. I'm a curious individual. I want to learn. I want to move in the world and absorb and make mistakes. So in fact, so much, I can't move this. All right. So much of the early works that I did were written about by many critics that I was brave enough to experiment in public because I started doing these works which were opposite of what I had been given attention for. So a lot of this for me creates really interesting situations of engaging with the other artists, bringing different types of languages into the miniature. For example, some of these works where I'm juxtaposing Langston Hughes with rap, with Nas, with Nasir Jones. I'm exploring the storytelling from a variety of vantage points, not just painting, but hip hop also. So in then New York, a place of integration, turmoil, which is still coming to terms with its underrepresentative narratives, including its African-American histories. That then, of course, the earlier works with Project Row Houses and Rick Lowe, those are all happening in 94. It's like 20 years later, MacArthur recognizes him in 2015 to give him the Genius Grant. So then the interesting other thing is in 1999, New York Times invited me to reflect on a topic that could be a turning point in the next century. So my response was The Many Faces of Islam, where I was looking at the interface of American foreign policy in Islamic countries and how the complexity of political foe and friends and the role reversals that is bound to happen because that's the history of Pakistan's entire history with America. So that would occupy the imagination. And that work was part of Imagining the Millennium by Living Artists, and it came to be regarded, this work, as a prescient work in the wake of September 11th. So this kind of interest in language and how you're thinking with the environment that you're part of. So in 2001, that's when I start exploring movement through video and animation, but it's all born from my drawings. So that action and dialogue allows a story to emerge in lifetime. And that is interesting to me, that how can you insert your physical experience into the work? And also, when you look at miniature paintings, how they are attributed. Like so many of the artists didn't even exist. They are attributed to fake names. Some of the artists some of the miniature painters didn't even exist. So this idea of ownership, attribution, is the provenance. So in that sense, yes, storytelling and history. So then I start working, like the digital work is a natural progression from the murals and installation done throughout the 90s. So now I'm experimenting with scale, with kinetic painting. Because when I look at Behzad, I see it's full of compressed motion. It's already in motion. Some of the forms are lyrical, if they are not very visually attractive to me, but there is lyricism and intelligent construction of form and color and proximity of all that which is right on the surface, placid but about to burst. So that's what I'm thinking when I'm thinking at miniatures, that they have answers in there. So I experiment with scale, then scoring becomes important, performance of that, the autonomy of the other. So the composer that I've been working with for like the last 10 years just won the Pulitzer. So there is this excitement that the partnerships are long, and they are not like, this is my work, here, make a score for it. I've brought people in and created languages also, and all of this is very hard to function in the commercial world, because I'm not creating objects that can be sold in the way that the pressure is there for artists, right? So that there is this very kind of difficult path, because you're in the art world, you're an artist. I've not had a gallery for many years. If you don't have a gallery in New York, then how much invisibility you have. So all of these things earlier on, when we were having that other discussion, I thought was very interesting, because there's so many layers. There's not just one interpretation. So Parallax happens, and it embodies power, conflict, omission, loss, maritime trade, oil gouache functions as oil in the piece itself. But Parallax gets realized in an abandoned cinema that I encountered in one of my visits to UAE while I was driving, and the caretaker is from Pakistan, who came to build the space in 1976 as a laborer. So this is his love, his life, his actual existence, his visa is connected to this particular building. So then he's as the sole survivor. Cyprus, despite its freedom, is held captive. To the garden is a phrase from Khalib. And so the caretaker becomes the protagonist. And I imagine Parallax through that encounter, and worked with poets to develop six particular poems which address geographical, emotional cartographies, how possession, ownership, rule, battles can take place in both concrete physical locations as well as the elusive terrain of memory and mind. And then moving forward from there, velocity, magnitude, direction, they all become essential aspects in creating time. And so the single unit of that female hair silhouette suddenly has tremendous possibilities. It's singular, representational, but when produced and choreographed in millions as moving images, which through scientific code writing, because my background is in math also, is like how that particle systems have suddenly they descend in Times Square, and they also have multiple. They could be spheres, swarms, birds, bats, insects, but that's not what I'm after. For me, the kinetic thrust is important, the enormous energy charge at the interface. Because with that undulating movement, you can the difference is there. I'm not changing the identity of the particle.
I just want to, for those who don't know,
Here
So this
is an
wonderful-
example.
Yes, the hair of the gopi figures.
But
Which,
also I feel
yeah.
like if it's not necessarily just gopi, right?
No, it
It's
could
the
be, yes.
representation of the female within a certain stylized, but it gets often talked about as gopi again,
Yeah.
because you have to talk
Yeah.
about the Muslim Hindu thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, then the Miraj, the visionary night journey, and the accession of the Prophet Muhammad is one of Islam's very mystical themes. So my interest stems from, of course, childhood familiarity, but also as a metaphor, Miraj, as for the emotional trust necessary in seeking artistic truth. So this is a portrait that I did, the Portrait of the Artist series, which is now in the collection of the National Portrait Galleries. So it becomes interesting because here I'm thinking the crystallized representations, right, of the historical works, which of course, as you know, were censored recently in my book. So the artist portraits function as vessels through which history can pass. And then I take this whole idea of the ecstasy as sublime, heart as vector, and the mosaic scroll becomes horizontal experience. The horizontal experience, the cinematic idea of very West cinematic idea, is upside down, and it's about monumentality. And here that was part of the language of economies. And I'll just sort of like end very soon here because I wanted to show how some of the protagonists function. So last post East India Company man continues to live on in new ways in the work that I created, and it's Adam Smith, who argues against monopolies using the demise of the East India Company as a case study, but we are still caught in the same old patterns. So he is now, his lofty ideas grow wings, but he's fluttering in the economics building. So it is permanently installed in the economics building at Princeton. And just last week, I installed this work at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And this is Nusrati's poem in Masnavi. And the reference to Sufi enlightenment, Hindu devotional bhakti, functions as a very interesting connective tissue because it carries the theme of strife and struggle for truth. But I'm looking also at Dakkan, right? So Dakkan is an interesting idea to look at because it's about the poem, but it's also the Muslim elite in South Central Asia, a North Indian Hindu love story recast as a Sufi tale for an Islamic court. So when Philadelphia Museum asked me to create this work, they wanted to bring this manuscript out of their storage. And they were like, how do we find an audience for it? How do we give it life, right? So then that's the interesting idea, is now the museums are also interested in how to archive this kind of things there. But then I questioned, like, well, how did it get there? What was the provenance? How did it end up at the PMA? Like, who translated the text, and who commissioned it? Who wrote it? Who's saying this is the story? Don't tell me this is the story. Because you can't give me a synopsis of 5,000 verses in Dakkan Urdu that nobody can translate. So then, it's interesting that how that now, of course, my interpretation is there, but it's in the South Asian art galleries, permanently installed, and from 2nd century BC to present, and I think I'm the only living artist in the galleries. So I don't think of me, it's like the art is what has, what has spark, what has life, and that's been a very interesting kind of idea in terms of how some of this history is so alive. And for me, that's like the detective in me that gets excited. I'll end there.
Thank you very much.